The central question of Easter, the main question that crops up in this story that's so familiar and yet so strange and mysterious at the same time. Why do you seek the living among the dead? You see, the women weren't looking for the resurrected Christ. They came to a tomb expecting to find what you usually find in a tomb. A dead body that had been laying there for a few days and was ready for the last portion of the ritual to send its soul on its way. They came bearing spices and aloes to wrap the body, to clean the body one last time as it began its final journey into death. But that's not what they found. They show up, and the stone from the tomb is already rolled away. They come in, and instead of a dead body, they find nothing. And they look, and they look, and they find these two angels, these two figures in gleaming white robes saying, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" It's a stunning revelation that Jesus isn't dead. It's not what they came to find. And yet it is what is there waiting for them. Life in the midst of death. It's a stunning revelation that brings back to them all of the words that Jesus has said over the past several years as they followed him around in Galilee, and now down to Jerusalem for the events that we remembered this past week, this Holy Week. Why do you seek the living among the dead? They go back and find the rest of their group, the rest of the disciples, who after some scoffing, go to the tomb themselves and discover that this isn't just an idle tale that the women are telling. The tomb isn't, the stone is rolled away. You do not find the living in the place of death. Now, almost 2,000 years later, this story seems very far off from who we are today and what we are today. We haven't come to a graveyard this morning or in a church. There was no great stone in front of the door that had been mysteriously moved away by who knows who. While there's a great group of us that are wearing white today, I will only speak for myself, but I will definitely say that I'm an angel. And things seem different. And yet, I think that question that the angels asked the women, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" is one that we have to turn around and ask ourselves today. Why do we seek the living among the dead? Why do we look for our deepest fulfillment, for our source of being and life, in places that always let us down, in places that always seem to disappoint us, to break us, and to leave us unsatisfied? Why do we look for the living among bank accounts, and bottles of booze, and new clothes, and a bigger house, and in being in with just the right people? Why do we seek the living among them? It's to our dead places that we come today. The places that we expect to find suffering, that we expect to find disappointment, that we expect to find lifelessness, hopelessness. But we find an openness there that wasn't there before. We find, as we look inside, that in the resurrection of Christ, there is life where before there was only death. There is hope where before there was only fear. There is light where before there was only darkness. Of course, that question why do you seek the living among the dead, isn't necessarily one that comes with a nice, pat answer. Rather, I think instead of it giving us an answer, a nice logical thing that we can absorb, maybe it points us in a new direction. Of course, that new direction, where we find the resurrected Christ living, where we find life, where we find hope, where we find faith, doesn't just happen in a vacuum. And it's not something that's just this magical overnight transformation, where once we were this way and now we're that way. After all, our story doesn't tell us that the women at the tomb were just changed in a moment. They were still terrified. They were still confused. They were still probably doubting what they saw. After all, how many times have you seen a body come back from the dead? How many times have you gone to go see the tomb of a loved one and had angels tell you that, oh, well, they're not here anymore, they've risen? It's not something that happens very often. And I think that the questions that come with it, the doubts that come with that revelation, the fear and the confusion about what it might mean for us and how it might change who and what we are very real things. And the women don't just check those at the door of the tomb when they go off to make their proclamation about what they've seen, about what they've experienced. Maybe our biggest fear on Easter is that we're not worthy enough to be bearers of those tidings. We don't even know if we believe this whole resurrection thing some of the time. What if we're just all really afraid of death, and this was a story that makes us feel better? What if we're just not good enough to proclaim this news about Christ? What if we're too afraid to be able to look at what it might mean that God has made us witnesses to the new life that is coming into the world through Jesus Christ? I think in our modern day and age, these are the questions that come to our mind, that we struggle with and that we wrestle with. Who am I to be the one who sees the empty tomb, to hear that the living one is not there? Well, no doubt those women probably had the exact same fears, the exact same doubts, the exact same reservations. After all, even their own friends, who had walked with Jesus and walked with them, scoffed at the news that they said, thought that it was an idle tale made up by a bunch of women. But they just take one step out of the tomb. And then another step after that. When they're afraid, when they're doubting. Just one step. And perhaps the invitation to us today is to just that simple thing. Just taking one step. Your step may look different than mine. Everybody's step in here may look a little different as the new life that we find in the place of the death that we expect starts to come alive in us. It may look like deciding to try this church thing again. It may look like setting aside more time to read the Bible or to pray. It may look like giving in the offering or to a not-for-profit that supports the needy in our community. It might look like a million different things, about doing one random act of kindness to help somebody out every week. It may just look like saying thank you for the things that you have that we so often take for granted. Just one step. Over the next several weeks here, as we travel from the empty tomb here of Easter to the fires of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes, time, and we're going to look at next steps. What can they look like for you? What can they look like for me? And then on Pentecost, during our worship, we're going to take some time to lift those things up prayerfully to God and make covenant together in community about how we can faithfully live out our witness to the truth that we see. Just one step. Like they say at a lot of groups that use the 12-step program, just one day at a time. There'll be good days, there'll be bad days. There are steps to take that are harder than others. But just one step. Just one step out the door here. Into a world that scoffs. Into a world that doubts. Into a world whose doubts we often share. But that one step takes us out into new life. Transforms us through the strange news that we hear proclaimed here today.